Thank you. Thank you for joining us today to talk all things education. So I'm Philissa Cramer. I'm the editor of JTA. Before I was here, I was an education reporter for more than 15 years. And so I always love talking back to school. It just so happens that this year, many of the stories that are top of mind for our readers and really kind of evolving minute by minute happen at JTA and at the New York Jewish Week happen to be education stories. So I'm really excited to let you hear today from two of the reporters who have been digging deep into multiple narratives each, these accidental education reporters who we have here today. So we have Julia Gergely, who is a reporter for the New York Jewish Week. And she's going to talk to you about small Y yeshivas and capital Y Yeshiva University. And we are also here with Andrew Lapin, who's been reporting about, well, we joke that Andrew is on the yikes beat at JTA, where if there's, something in the news like the banning or the removal of a version of Anne Frank's diary from a public school library, we all say yikes, and Andrew goes and reports what has actually happened and what does it mean. So he'll be sharing with you today from his reporting about book bans, as well as an emerging story or something that's kind of a little bit underneath the radar, a strategy that is kind of redoubling and we're seeing it being used more often to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses. It's a controversial strategy and one that has provoked a real clash of ideas at the University of Vermont. So Andrew has been on top of that, and we will talk about all of this. We welcome your questions. I'll monitor for them. So if you have got a question as we're going, and I can see it and I can ask it, we'll ask it as we go. We can also, we'll also have time at the end to come back to those questions. This is really going to be kind of like a survey course of education issues in the Jewish world right now. We're going to cover a lot during our time together. And then there will be an exam. I think that's appropriate. So welcome again. And yeah, as I call on you each, Julie and Andrew, share a little bit more about kind of who you are, what you do, and what you're thinking right now. But Julie, I want to start with you. Yeshivas, New York City, Hasidic schools that enroll up to about 150,000 students in the city and region. Zev landed in the front page of the New York Times over the last week, and there's also been alongside that, some changes in the education policy space. Can you just catch everyone here up on what the story is right now and what your reporting has looked like?
Yes, so hi everyone, I'm Julia Gergely. I'm a reporter for the New York Jewish Week. I've been here for about a year, and part of my beat has been covering the New York City yeshivas and how they're operating and what the secular education looks like and what the government has started to do to try to regulate it. So the story is decades old. It started, but the state opened an investigation against the yeshivas in 2015, which the results actually have not been, the state and the city results of the investigation have not been concluded yet. But I think we're thinking with this New York Times story, things are going to start moving a little bit faster. So a lot of what I've been reporting on has been what the state is doing to start regulating secular education in Hasidic yeshivas. And they've introduced these regulations called substantial equivalency, which is basically how the Hasidic yeshivas can prove that they are providing a equivalent secular education to New York City's public schools. And that has been a super long process that actually just got approved last week at the same weekend as the New York Times story. So these are two separate stories. The New York Times investigation and these secular education regulations in yeshivas. So that is kind of the overview of what I've been reporting on this year. Philissa, you're muted.
Thank you. In the investigation, most people here probably have seen it or seen our reporting about it. The investigation painted a pretty searing picture of very, very scant secular instruction in Hasidic schools, particularly the schools for boys. Graduates of these schools who spoke to the Times and have spoken to you over time and spoken to other reporters have said that they were left unprepared for life after high school, particularly when they made the choice to leave the Hasidic world and want to work in the secular world. So this has been a kind of an ongoing tension for a long time. Why does that critique elicit, and maybe we haven't been clear, like that critique elicits extreme tension. This is one of the most anger-filled narratives that I think we've covered. Very strong feelings on all sides. Can you kind of share a little bit about the strength of the feelings and where you think that comes from?
Yes, so from what I've been reporting from the people who have been advocating within the Hasidic community for secular education and the people that have been advocating against it, it's like some of the most polarizing, strongest feeling emotion stories that I've been reporting over the last year. And I think a lot of it comes from the people against secular education, like especially in the Hasidic community. They want to protect their way of life, and it's make or break for them, because once the government gets involved in this way, it's seen as very threatening, and people don't know where the line is going to be drawn if we let the government come and regulate the yeshivas. On the other hand, thousands of boys, men, girls, and women are graduating every year who aren't proficient in science, history, social studies, math, and English. And they feel like that is a human right. Education is a right in this country, and the government has let them down by not protecting them, and because they're children, and they're looking back on their lives saying, no one was helping me. I just feel like completely abandoned by the country that I live in. So it's been super emotional, and I don't think we can overstate how much of an important topic it is in Hasidic communities right now. It's one of the most talked about things of this decade, I would say.
And what have you seen, in the week since this investigation came out and the state education officials kind of finalizing those regulations that ask yeshivas to prove that they're offering a substantially equivalent education? What are some of the responses you've seen, and how are things going for those in the community who were kind of pushing for exactly this kind of exposure?
Mm-hmm. So I think in response to New York Times article, there was a huge range of responses. For those pushing for education reform, they're finally being validated in the biggest paper in the country, and it's finally on paper, on the record. This is what's happening to us, and it's a huge relief that someone put the time in, and everyone in the world has noticed. In response to the new state regulations, it's been really interesting to see how the government's operated. They had 4 years ago introduced regulations that said every yeshiva will need to be reviewed by a local school authority. That eventually got thrown out. Got hundreds of thousands of comments from everyone from all sides. They introduced new regulations this year that would say, in order to be deemed equivalent, schools will either need to be reviewed or take state assessments, or they can be accredited by a different organization. So they have many different options now where they didn't before. So the people that want to maintain the status quo at Hasidic yeshivas currently are applauding that to a degree. They're saying, okay, we have options. We can I think one of the options is to make their own accreditation organizations and accredit their own schools. Whereas, the people for education reform for secular education see that as a huge loophole. So they're saying the state's taking notice, people are finally listening, but there are still so many loopholes that people are a little bit cautious, although relieved. And then on the pro yeshiva side, people are still very angry and very worried that the government is going to keep intruding on their education, although they have said publicly that these multiple options, it's called multiple pathways, is something that they're willing to work with. So I think the next part of my reporting will definitely be watching and keeping my ears open to see exactly what people do and how they respond. And if non-Jewish organizations start getting more involved in either direction, and how yeshivas are going to respond. Are they going to dig in their heels, or are they going to work with the government? Yeah.
We published a piece by two journalists who 7 years ago did a very similar investigation for the New York Jewish Week, in partnership with WNYC, and really documented the very same picture that the New York Times did, including, details about the political forces that might discourage elected officials and state officials from going to the mat with yeshivas, even if they're not in compliance with state regulations. And so we published a piece by the journalists, Hella Winston and Amy Sarah Clark, about what hasn't changed, what has. And I'm curious to hear from you, Julia, two things. One is what's different for us as a Jewish publication about how we take on this topic compared to the New York Times. And then the other is looking ahead. Are we going to see a piece written by you in 7 years? Or kind of, based on your reporting, what do you think the kind of future narrative may hold?
So I think for your first question, what is different for us as Jewish media? We have different readership and we have different responsibility on reporting these stories. I mean, the New York Times, one of their big narratives in their piece, which I think is very important, was that amount of public funding that these yeshivas are getting while still failing these children. And while I think that's super important, we're not coming at it from the angle, or at least I am not in my reporting, of they're using government funding irresponsibly. I'm coming at it of, we're serving the Jewish people, that there are readership there who we're reporting on. How can we lift the Jewish people up? Is it exposing how they're failing their children? Is it showing how they're making way to reform? Is it explaining what the Jewish value is on education and why some people think that education is a Torah education, why some people think that's a secular education? So I think we have a very different responsibility as Jewish media to report on this, and that's the angle that I think we can contribute, and hopefully 7 years from now things will develop and we will be able to explain it Jewishly, because I know everyone here is, that's why you guys are here too, is to learn about it from that perspective, because we all feel so attached to the subject, even though in a way that the average New York Times reader doesn't necessarily have to.
All right, I think switch gears for the moment. We welcome questions for Julia about the New York Times investigation on Hasidic yeshivas and the follow-up that she and other members of our team are doing. But I want to switch gears to another topic where the way that we cover the news as a Jewish publication is very different from the way the news gets portrayed in secular media, and that is around book bans and removals, and this whole mess of a dynamic that is unfolding across a lot of the United States right now. So Andrew, why don't you kind of give us the background on what is going on when we see the headline Anne Frank diary pulled from Texas classroom?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Lapin. I'm a managing editor of local news at JTA. And this is one of the things I've been following in the world of secular education. You are probably familiar with some of these stories because they are among our most read stories of the year to date. But to quickly recap, in February, a school district in rural Tennessee, McMinn County, voted to remove this book, Art Spiegelman's Maus, the graphic memoir of his parents' experiences in the Holocaust, from its middle school curriculum. And then flashing forward to this past August, a school district in Keller, Texas, just outside of Fort Worth, announced that just before the start of the school year, their libraries needed to remove this book, Anne Frank's diary, the graphic adaptation, which is a graphic novel version of her diary, based on the original text of her diary, that they also needed to remove this book from their shelves. In between, in April, in a school district in the Florida Panhandle, there was a ban or a removal of a Jewish children's book called The Purim Superhero by Elizabeth Kushner. What do all these incidents have in common? They are part of a much larger and more vast movement. It is by and large a conservative-led movement, a mix of sort of grassroots efforts at local school board meetings, as well as sort of larger efforts funded by political action committees to really make an issue around books and around education materials and teachers in public schools. The argument and the sort of line that we have heard has dated back a couple of years now, but it is based around the idea that these sort of new theories of education, things like terms you might have heard like critical race theory or gender theory, that there is some kind of effort underway to indoctrinate school-aged children in public schools. And so we see that there are these movements being led that are removing dozens and dozens of books. We do need to point out these are books largely, almost entirely, that do not have to do with Jewish issues. They largely have to do with issues of race, with race history, as well as with gender and sexuality. Many of the books that make these lists of books that get removed from districts include, frank depictions of sex or sexual violence. And all of this sort of gets mixed together. And what happens is that these lists of books are creating more of a tension around the question of appropriateness in schools. And that is where we see some of these Holocaust classics, or books that we in the Jewish community tend to think of as classics in the world of Holocaust education, books that are specifically designed, particularly in the case of the Anne Frank book, specifically designed to help young readers understand a very difficult and very traumatic subject, such as the Holocaust. These books are getting caught up in these big sweeps, these big sort of ideological campaigns based around some of these issues of this kind of fear or this moral panic of critical race theory sort of sneaking into schools and affecting what children are learning. The whys of how each one of these books found its way onto the hit list, as it were, are slightly different for each one. And in some cases, particularly in Anne Frank, we saw that not even a week after the initial rule came from the school that the book had to be removed, that decision following the most recent school board meeting was reversed, and the Anne Frank books wound up back on the shelf. In the case of Maus in Tennessee, the school district there did not bow to intense public pressure. They kept the book off of their middle school curriculum. However, we know that this story generated such an immense amount of publicity that hundreds and hundreds, possibly thousands of copies of Maus were sent to Tennessee, enough for every student in that particular district to get a free copy of the book, should they so choose, and then some, right? The really like flooding the local libraries and all that, because these were the books among as I said, the many dozens of books, including some written by acclaimed authors such as Toni Morrison and beyond. These were the ones that really generated the most intense and the most vociferous headlines, certainly from Jewish publications such as ourselves, but also from the broader press and the broader education press, when they have sort of talked about the extent to which these campaigns have reached, sort of they are often pointed to as examples of kind of overreach when it comes to some of this zealotry, this insistence on screening and removing books that certain parties deem inappropriate for children.
One of the things, you've been doing some reporting on kind of Holocaust educators or educators in public schools who teach the Holocaust, and how they're looking at these incidents and the broader trends that are confronting all educators right now, and contemplating how their work might be affected on an ongoing basis or a more fundamental basis. What are you hearing from them?
It is definitely a concern for a lot of people who work in the Holocaust education space. One thing that we need to keep in mind here is that there has been a lot of concerted push on statewide levels, even though there are these sort of two things happening at once, right? A lot of states have been passing these so-called anti-critical race theory bills that are dictating that that public schools cannot teach their kids about anything that might there's a lot of bizarre wording out there, but lessons that might implicate a student for the actions of the past, or bring about feelings of guilt and these sorts of things. The laws are often intentionally worded in a vague way to encourage teachers not to try to step over the line. At the same time, thanks in large part to activism from Holocaust education circles, there are now laws mandating some form of Holocaust education in, I believe, something over 30 states. I would need to double check the exact number, but somewhere around 35 states, which is quite a large number, have some kind of Holocaust education mandate in their K through 12 public school curriculum. And so these things, you could look at them and say, they seem a little bit in conflict with each other. How do you teach about historical evils of the past, of which certainly the Holocaust is arguably the greatest? How do you teach about that while also not making your students feel bad, or introducing ideas about how regular people sat and did nothing, or about certain actions taken by the U.S. During the Holocaust, which were not always admirable. These are exactly the same kinds of issues that politicians and activists have been so quick to denounce when they show up in other parts of the curriculum, such as discussing slavery. And so transplanting that to the world of Holocaust studies is making a lot of educators very nervous, because they worry that these isolated incidents are going to lead to teachers who really don't know and feel unprepared for how to address a subject as massive as this. In the case of Maus, that book had been designed as the cornerstone of that district's Holocaust education mandate. That was the book that they built their curriculum around. And so the teachers there were really left sort of without a crucial text upon which to teach their students, almost none of whom had ever met a Jewish person before, about the Holocaust. But it remains a complicated subject. Art Spiegelman himself said after this controversy blew up that he's not even entirely sure that his book should be taught to children. And what made him upset wasn't necessarily like he wanted to have a debate about whether the book Maus was appropriate for children, but he was very upset, he said, by the reasoning that the school board gave for why they felt his book was inappropriate for children. It had nothing to do with the discussion of the Holocaust. It had to do with his illustrated drawings of nudity and of children in peril, which are, again, subjects that seem immaterial or somehow insufficient when you think about the grandiose tragedy of the Holocaust. And these kinds of discussions require a lot of nuance that Holocaust educators are worried is being lost in this push to sort of, in the eyes of some, like delouse the schools of any book that has a hint of liberal ideology to it.
I mean, the other piece of what has been, broadly been a target for critics of the way teaching is done now is, there's a lot of these laws, I don't think you used the phrase, they prohibit, they require kind of balance in the teaching of divisive topics. And we had a couple incidents last year, and I think that, we know, looking at the world, that for some people out there, the Holocaust, it feels like a divisive topic, maybe for all kinds of reasons, including denial, right? So we had some incidents where Holocaust education kind of got caught up got ensnared in the debate through that lens. Might be a little bit ancient history, but if you have it in your brain, if you could remind us about that piece of the puzzle too.
That's right, yeah. So starting about a year ago, as I said, we started seeing these so-called anti-critical race theory bills being introduced, and in some cases passed in various state legislatures, including pretty large states like Texas. And as part of their wording, these laws said that when you teach a divisive topic, you need to teach sort of both sides of it. And the wording is certainly suspect, but it comes to play, especially when you talk about how do you teach a subject like the Holocaust, and if you are mandated by law to teach it from a non-divisive perspective. And so we have seen that sometimes teachers go to their superintendents and ask this question. Sometimes local reporters are asking them of the state legislators that have introduced the laws. And so we've seen, in Texas, as well as in Ohio and Indiana, and there was some discussion in West Virginia as well, that the answer sometimes is, well, you have to teach the Holocaust from both sides. You have to teach it from the perspective of the Jews, and you have to somehow teach it from the perspective of the Nazis. As one Ohio state lawmaker said, you have to teach it from the perspective of a German soldier. An Indiana lawmaker said that teachers have to remain neutral on subjects such as Nazism. And so these kinds of statements, or the logic behind some of these bills, seems to many in the Holocaust education space to be pretty ignorant of how the Holocaust not only unfolded, but how it has historically been taught in schools, and what are sort of the proven effective ways of teaching the Holocaust. And with student knowledge of the Holocaust, including such basic facts as how many Jews were murdered during the course of the Holocaust at all-time lows, according to the various organizations that track this sort of thing. It is certainly worrisome to suddenly be told that if you're going to teach the subject, you have to find a way to teach it neutrally.
From a journalism perspective, Andrew, like something that you and I talk a lot about is, and you mentioned this here, like this push broadly is not meant to target Holocaust instruction. It is meant to target often instruction about race, and really increasingly instruction about tolerance of LGBTQ families. There's a broad kind of anti-trans element of the kind of book banning divisive topics movement. Something we talk about a lot is our role. Are we distorting the truth by focusing on the issues that are, and incidents that are of particular note to Jewish audiences? And I think that's a real wrestling that we do a lot of the time when we're making choices about what to cover. But tell us all a little bit about how you think about that, and just your reflections there.
Yes, it's a good point. It's definitely worth mentioning that third Jewish book that I mentioned, the banned Jewish book called The Purim Superhero, that was removed from a Florida school district, was removed because the protagonist of that book has two fathers. And so that's the sort of thing that in the Jewish children's literature space was praised as being, diverse and inclusive and reflective of many modern Jewish families. And then when you sort of take it out of that bubble almost, and you see how sort of the broader public interprets the message of a book like that, they find it threatening to their children. And so that is why something like that gets the boot, even though nothing in it could ever be thought of as explicit content. It's a good question. There's the sort of constant tension that we have, where are we simply being too narrow-sighted or myopic by only focusing on these Jewish books, but as we've seen, these are the books that are resonating, again, not just with our readers, but with the broader public in general. People who might say to themselves, well, I don't necessarily agree that explicit graphic novels should be in our school libraries, but I don't want them to remove Anne Frank, and it does kind of serve as a wake-up call, we found, to the broader public. And I'll also add, these are questions that today's Holocaust educators are really wrestling with. Several Holocaust organizations, not all of them, several, have actually thought about how to reapply or rethink the traditional Holocaust curriculum to have it include broader discussions of modern social justice struggles and what kinds of lessons, can students draw from the Holocaust, particularly students who, again, might not really have a Jewish background or may not know Jewish friends, but they hear the stories of the Holocaust. And then what does that sound like to you? How do you think about that in a modern context? And, teachers have described that prompting, often very, very fruitful discussions among students who are, maybe mature enough to have those kinds of discussions. But those are also exactly the sorts of discussions that you might classify as divisive, or that are sort of in the crosshairs of some of these movements. We remember sort of the attention paid to the New York Times' 1619 Project and the way that sort of reconstituted the history of this country, and how that provoked sort of reams of legislation on the right aimed at curbing what was seen as its influence in schools. All of these things, some would say are linked, that the struggles of Jews to have our plight, understood by the broader public and secular schools are related to how other marginalized groups, seek to do the same thing. And frankly, there are just too many books being removed from schools right now for us to do a decent job of cataloging them. Many books from Jewish authors that we haven't touched on that are not specifically about Jewish subjects have also been removed. It's an ongoing, some would say, crisis, certainly in the free speech movement and in that sort of space. So it's something that we're going to continue to watch, because it's concerning to many people, including Jews.
Thank you. I see a lot of links, so I appreciate that. And we've talked about a ton of stories that we've done over the last 6 months. All those links are there in the chat for you if you want to catch up on news you might have missed. I want to apologize. I think someone's cutting down a tree outside my house if it suddenly got loud. I do want to just invite anyone here to share questions about anything you're hearing. We'll have time to answer all of that. But for now, let's go back to you, Julia, and let's talk about capital Y Yeshiva University and its landing in the national headlines over the last weeks in a way that's extremely deeply felt on campus and within the school community. Can you catch everyone up on what we're talking about here?
Yes, so this is the other big story that I've been following throughout this year of reporting. It also has to do with, by and large, government involvement in a religious institution, which Yeshiva University has deemed themselves a religious institution. So this story is about this case called Yeshiva University versus the YU Pride Alliance, which is a campus LGBTQ club that has been around for about a little bit more than a decade, although it has never been official on campus. They've never been allowed recognition. So they've been operating pretty much underground, and they've been funded by outside organizations, but it's been really difficult for them to gain traction and to gain community. So they filed a lawsuit against Yeshiva University in the spring of 2021, basically claiming they were being discriminated against because they were queer students and they weren't allowed to have an official club on campus. And YU said it went against the school's religious values to officially endorse a club supporting LGBTQ students. So in this spring, a New York State judge ruled that because Yeshiva University in their charter is incorporated as a secular institution, and they did that in order to receive government funding and public grants, they fell under the New York City human rights law, which meant that it would be discrimination for them not to have an official pride club if the students wanted it, which they do. So Yeshiva University this summer filed an emergency stay to the Supreme Court. They appealed that case to the New York court, and they filed a stay motion to the Supreme Court saying, while our case is waiting for an appeal, let's remain to the status quo of not having a pride club while we wait for an appeal. The Supreme Court originally said, okay, like, you don't have to have a pride club. And then they reversed that decision a week later. So that also happened last week. And the Supreme Court said, you need to appeal it all the way up to the New York courts before you come to us, because they did it out of order by going straight to the Supreme Court. They said, while you do the appeals, you have to have a pride club. That's what the state ordered. You can appeal all the way up. If you lose, you can come back to us. It's not actually a total loss, quote unquote, for Yeshiva University, because 4 judges ruled that they don't need a pride club. So basically, if it goes to the Supreme Court, which it likely will, it's almost guaranteed to be reviewed by the US Supreme Court, which is a huge deal and a bit just a big turning point, I think, for the case of this pride club, and also for religious liberty and religious freedom cases.
And we know that the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court with its conservative majority, has indicated its willingness and eagerness to rule in favor of those who are claiming infringements on religious freedom. So I think there's a real concern among those who would like to see YU recognize the Pride Alliance that while a club is supposed to be allowed right now, ultimately the school may be permitted to bar it. But while that was the ruling, what is actually happening at YU right now?
So another twist in the story. So the Supreme Court said Wednesday, you guys need to have a pride club. That's what the state ordered until you appeal the case. On Friday afternoon, right before Shabbat, right before the high holidays, YU sent an email to their all the undergrads from student activities and said, we're going to suspend all clubs for the time being while we figure this out. Essentially, that's what it said. So that's about 90 clubs on campus. That includes like the surfing club, it includes the business club, it includes fashion club, just broad range of student interests. Think back to when you were in college, like just the things that you did with your friends and the things that you engaged with outside of class. So they're suspending those for the time being while they figure out how to appeal and take the Supreme Court's order, which is to go back to the New York courts. And when I reported this on Friday, I guess it's Monday now, the students I talked to said they hadn't received any instruction, especially student leaders, student council, student union, so they hadn't received any instruction or warning from the school yet about how to proceed, because that's really the only instruction they got. So I think everyone's a bit confused and shocked, and it's unclear as of today, like when YU is gonna have a plan for them, but I assume something maybe will come this week, but maybe after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as well.
There's been, the president of YU has issued several statements at every kind of juncture along the way, expressing his support for LGBTQ students at YU, emphasizing that it's his hope that YU is an inclusive community. How are we supposed to square those statements with the school's, the concrete steps the school is taking, as you're describing, to rather than permit perhaps temporarily a club from being recognized, to shut down all clubs? A pretty blunt approach that really, hurts a lot of people.
So yeah, at every moment in this story, which has been going on for years, YU has said, we love our LGBTQ students, we just can't have an official club on campus, which seems to be, it's not enough for a lot of the advocates for this club and for a lot of the LGBTQ students. They're saying, how can you say you love us if you're going to file to the Supreme Court in order to not recognize us on campus? But I think YU is at a really complicated juncture right now, in that, yes, they're taking government funding, but they're saying you can't deny we're a religious institution, which maybe not in their charter they are, but they are a religious institution. They have Torah values in everything they do, and again, it's how much will you let the government intervene, and what's going to come next if we let this happen. It is interesting to me that it happens to be the Pride Club that pushed it over the edge of, we need to take a stand about how far the government can go. So YU's case, while they're saying we love our LGBTQ students, it's not actually so much about you. It's more about how the government's ordering us what to do. It's separation of church and state. The LGBTQ, I mean, the victims still are the LGBTQ students who don't have the dignity of being able to meet on campus openly. And they are being harmed by this decision, although I do recognize how complicated it has been for YU to follow through with this, because they do have a real argument, which First Amendment lawyers that I've talked to throughout my reporting very frequently have said this is going to be like a very interesting case for the Supreme Court to rule that might cause precedent for future religious liberty cases.
So there's a petition going around right now by students, graduates, faculty, maybe not current faculty, but former faculty, people who have been in the YU community, expressing their, I think, deep anger and hurt by what's going on right now. How do you see this playing out? Because on the one hand, you have YU, seeking to take the legal steps to force a case that I think, however it goes, will be important. On the other, you've got an institution that needs the support of its community to function. Maybe it doesn't need it, but institutions work better when they have the support of their community. So is that petition representative of the community? And is this pushback how is this pushback being felt?
So last week, students, alumni, and faculty sent around a petition. Last week, it was around 150 signatures, which is a small number, but it was very strongly worded message to the YU administration saying, we don't recognize this institution anymore. This doesn't support our values, and something needs to change. This isn't what we want for ourselves at our university. And then on the other hand, YU has a number of graduate schools that are much more, not all Jewish students, a lot of just non-Jewish secular students go to the med school, graduate schools in psychology, social work school, law school. And the graduate schools have really come out and said, like, this, we cannot condone this message that the YU is sending to their undergraduate students. So I will say the people I've talked to have been pretty strongly upset by how YU is proceeding. I can't say it's representative, just because I know that there is a wide range of opinions on this issue, and I know a lot of people are worried about how far the government will go if they need to, interfering in YU. So I think among students, it's especially the canceling of all the clubs, that was kind of a wake-up call for students that weren't necessarily involved, that said, oh, it's not my issue, that's just for the LGBTQ club. Now it is starting to affect them, it's starting to come down on them. My hope would be that they can say take a strong stance to the administration, say this is not okay, this isn't what we need. But there are some concerns that I've heard, that because YU canceled the clubs, there will be more like homophobia on campus, saying the LGBTQ club caused this and whatnot. So I've heard that there are concerns that will happen. I haven't heard of that happening yet, but it has only been a few days. And yeah.
I want to update, because you said that there was a petition last week with about 150 names. I just took a peek and it looks like it's at about 800 names now. All of those names are being carefully vetted to make sure that those people are legitimate, authentic members of the community, not just, people out there who want to sign on. So
yeah, so that is,
this is a conversation that's gathering steam, and I think we're going to hear a lot about it between now and the ultimate conclusion of the litigation. And you will keep covering it. It's a very deeply held, very deeply felt story, and one, as you said, Julia, that positions a Jewish institution to potentially make precedent for the entire country. So something to be watching over the next year. Still welcome some questions. Let's take a few minutes and just zip over to, and I think this is a appropriate, like, smaller amount of time, to what is going on at the University of Vermont, where a kind of set of circumstances that we've seen repeat themselves in multiple universities over the last couple of years took a bit of a weird turn last week. So Andrew, if you want to give us the short form.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week, the University of Vermont in Burlington became kind of ground zero for this question that is on a lot of Jews' minds right now. Is it safe to be a Jewish student on a secular campus? Is the state of Israel discourse, or is the state of so-called campus anti-Semitism so awful that people cannot be openly Jewish on major state universities? We have seen this being played out in the legal field. In 2019, the Trump administration ordered new guidelines at the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which investigates complaints that are filed to the office regarding whether students' civil rights have been violated in education environments. The amendments in 2019 added anti-Semitism to the purview of that department, of the education department. And since then, we have seen around a half dozen cases of that department announcing that it was going to be forming investigations to look at anti-Semitism complaints filed by Jewish students or filed by organizations on behalf of Jewish students on various campuses around the country. So last week it did this at the University of Vermont. A complaint was filed by sort of two groups that are key to this story. One is the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, which is a legal organization that has filed many of these kinds of complaints with the Office of Civil Rights. And then they have filed this complaint in partnership with a group called Jewish on Campus, which is sort of a campus anti-Semitism watchdog group that posts a lot of messages on Instagram. Jewish students submit, instances that they have experienced on campus where they have felt ostracized or marginalized. So both these groups filed this complaint together. One of the key figures of Jewish on Campus is a former University of Vermont student. The complaint is pretty wide-ranging. It alleges a long list of ways in which the university failed to take action against an anti-Semitic climate that was fostering on campus. Many of these examples, as you can probably imagine, because it's played out in other schools, have involved Israel discourse, Israel on campus. And they have included, in this case, a teaching assistant, graduate teaching assistant at UVM, who posted on social media about lowering the grades of Zionist students in her class. They've included instances of student organizations that are not whose official relationship to the campus is in doubt, but who have student organizations that have said that they do not want to admit Zionist students, including one that is a support group for sexual assault survivors on campus. And so the Department of Education announced last week that they were opening this investigation. What happened after that was quite unusual because the president of the University of Vermont issued a very strongly worded statement disputing the charges of the investigation and saying that the claims that there is an anti-Semitic climate on the University of Vermont are simply false and actually refuted the points line by line. Other university administrations that have been the subject of U.S. Department of Education investigations over this kind of thing have kept silent. And they have said, we're going to wait for the investigation to play out. We saw that happening at USC. We saw this happening at Brooklyn College and others. University of Vermont has become much more combative in this instance, and they view this actually as a threat to the to the well-being of their students. They say that this is fear mongering, that this is sort of like outside agitators that are misinterpreting or sort of deliberately obscuring the truth of what has actually happened in these documented incidents. They say they took swift and appropriate action to deal with all allegations of anti-Semitism that were brought to the administration. And so this is turning into a real war of the words, and big Jewish groups, including the ADL and the AJC and others that you would sort of define as sort of more openly sort of pro-Israel legal groups, have issued statements of concern or sometimes outright condemning the university and the university president. And so this is all kind of playing out right now, and this is something that we're going to be watching because with the university with this investigation playing out and with sort of these stakes in the ground being driven, it's going to become a discourse subject of consideration for us.
And I think, as with all discourse subjects, like it matters, right? And our challenge as journalists is to sketch out why and to whom and who is really wrestling with that. I think as with all of these topics that we've discussed today, there's a level at which there's a fight, and there's a level at which people are living within the communities and acting upon them and having the institutions act back upon them. And those, the discourse and the lived experience are overlapping often, but not always the same. And so one of the challenges, and a challenge we really embrace as journalists at JTA and the New York Jewish Week, is to explain, both halves of that Venn diagram. I think, Andrew, should we scoop ourselves here a little bit and give everybody like an early idea? We just today started talking about having Andrew get out to Burlington, Vermont, and do some reporting on the ground to use this incident and this institution that's really shaping up to be a flashpoint in the campus anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism discourse wars, and see what's really happening and what Jewish students and students from across the spectrum are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not going to make a promise yet, early reporting conversation, but that's the kind of reporting that we strive to do, to make these big ideas and big points of tension concrete. I think it's our last call for questions. I will just mention that a couple stories that we have coming. One story we have coming that brings that comparative perspective, taking things back to the beginning of our conversation and the New York Hasidic Yeshivas, looking at what's happening in Israel right now, where, in New York, the concern about what's happening in yeshivas, it's about the welfare of 50, 75,000, 100,000 children, right, and their community. Israel is wrestling too with the question of secular education in Haredi yeshivas, but it's not just a question of the welfare of those children. It's a question about that has pretty broad implications for the state because it's large. I think it's about almost up to a third of school children now are in these yeshivas that offer very little in the way of secular instruction. So there too, there's been a push for more, and there was a breakthrough. The government convinced, rather than in New York where there's more discussion of sticks. Can we take away money or take away rights if you don't comply? The Israeli government came up with some carrots. We're going to give some additional resources to yeshivas and networks of yeshivas that agree to teach more secular subjects. And the second largest network of schools, the Belts yeshivas, took the deal. There's a breakthrough moment in this question of how do we get more secular instruction for Haredi children. Then, just this past week, Benjamin Netanyahu, striving to return to office in November in the upcoming election, announced that he would junk that deal and not require anything from those yeshivas or any others, and continue to pass along the same resources without that agreement. So very live issue there, a live issue in New York, a live issue actually in England, Canada, Australia. And so one of the things that we're going to try to do for everyone is put in conversation the experiences of Jewish communities across the world. That's what we do at JTA. Bring those into conversation and see what we can learn locally and as a community. So thank you all for joining. I'm scrolling through. I see, again, lots of links. Please take a moment to read these stories. Not too many questions, but we appreciate all of those that did come in and will come in the future. Be in touch. These are all storylines that are not going anywhere, and we will continue covering them long after the back to school season has ended. So thank you, Julia. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we'll stay in touch.